Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. How's it going, Joe?
Doing good. So, yeah, wrapping up the year. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, how did we get to December 20th? Because I don't remember that happening.
Well, we started on January 1st.
yeah, that I
Then we,
vaguely remember, but I don't know how we got here.
Then we moved. We kept going. So, how's it going, everybody? It's Joe and Matt. We're actually hanging out today over at my house. So, getting some work done. We figured why not do the Monday morning data chat in person. So you'll probably see a bit more of us in the future, recording from here or wherever. So how was your weekend?
It's a new era. It was good. Got some writing done, got some other work done, did a bit of socializing. Saw my sister I hadn't seen in a couple months.
Oh, wow, nice. That's awesome.
Too much work lately, but we're almost through the year. So
yeah, speaking of the year, so today we're going to talk about some of the things that we thought were pretty awesome in the data space for 2021, as well as 2022 predictions. I'm not a big fan of predictions, but I feel this is it's worth talking about what kind of where we think things are going. Plus, it makes for good clickbait, to be honest. So,
seriously, yeah. And part of what we're going to do, to be quite frank, is actually make sort of anti-predictions. In other words, talk about uncertainty in 2022, which I think if you're being hyper optimistic, then you're going to ignore uncertainty. We think that's a mistake. We think we all need to talk about uncertainty and how to cope with it in both the business and the tech space.
Right. Yeah. Because I think, especially with Omicron and other stuff, it's pretty obvious that we're not out of the woods yet with this, this pandemic, or I guess it's an endemic almost now, but
seems like it. Yeah. And I think one of the hardest things about the whole experience over the last 2 years is just the uncertainty of it, right? It's never quite knowing what's coming next or when it's going to be over.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
But that said, I think there are some macro trends that are happening in data, though, that, which we can talk about, that I don't see them really going anywhere in 2022. But let's talk about it. I mean, so what are some of the things that we liked in 2021?
We're seeing continued migration to the cloud. That's very exciting.
Why is that exciting?
I think in terms of the technological possibilities, right? I think we both kind of came up in the era of peak big data, which was an exciting time to be involved in data. And as it's turning out, I think cloud is the kind of next generation for most companies. I mean, if you're massive like Facebook, then you can build your own internal data platforms. Most companies, even big enterprises, don't have the resources to do that.
Right.
And now you have suddenly great access to just these amazing data products without having to put together a huge engineering team to build your own. So
yeah, I think during COVID, that definitely acceleration to the cloud happened, and we haven't seen that let up at all. I mean, the things that we've seen anecdotally, and also kind of plays out by whatever numbers are published, is that cloud growth continues. So I think, depending on who you ask, I mean, I think the numbers are around maybe 20 to 30% cloud penetration at this point. Depending, I guess, again, who you ask. 'Cause I've also seen like everybody's in the cloud, but that means you're probably using like I don't know, a SaaS product or something. So it depends on how you want to count it. So we're talking about workloads that go to the cloud, right?
Well, and just percentage of, let's say, IT spend, then that gets kind of hairy too, right? Because like, how do you differentiate between the spend on maintaining that infrastructure versus the spend of actually owning the buildings to run the infrastructure versus the servers themselves? But if you choose some consistent way of measuring that, what you see is the spend is gradually shifting more to cloud platforms over time. So across the enterprise space. And it used to be just startups that were doing this in the early days of cloud and AWS, and gradually it's like larger and larger companies that are seeing the value here.
Yeah, for sure. There's a cloud. What's that?
Oh, I think another interesting thing is that we may see the size of the pie itself, the IT pie, increase. In other words, if companies get more value from their IT spend, then they're going to be willing to spend more money, right? So we saw this over time with various technologies as it got easier to use, as cars got more efficient. Paradoxically, people use more gas because they drove more miles, right? Because it was more economical to get places. And we may find the same thing ultimately in the cloud, that is, it's easier to deploy IT technology, the spend actually increases overall.
Right. Yeah, I think coupling with that too is just the explosion of tools in the data space. I would say there's probably an explosion of tools in general, especially SaaS and open source. But looking at like Matt Turk's MAD index that came out a couple months ago, like that really highlights it. Just there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of money, being thrown into startups, which means there's going to be a lot of startups. We've hit on this in past episodes, but it's kind of funny when we think about the feedback loops really that are influencing everything, right? So it's like low interest rate environment, explosion in data, which means lots of money to fund products and so forth, right? So again, when I can turn this into an economics argument, but what I do see is interesting, and this will touch into 2022, is that there's just a lot of activity right now. I would say that the thing that I like and dislike about 2021 is there's more tools than ever that are available, which I think is awesome because it shows a lot of interest in the space, but it also makes trying to keep up on things and recommending tools to people just like impractically difficult and sometimes impossible. So
yeah, and the other thing you pointed out is that a lot of the best tools are coming from startup companies that are well funded but aren't actually making any revenue yet. And we think they should be making revenue. Like their products are great and they're going to have a big impact. But the question is, what is that? Yeah, right. But it's
my friend, shout out to Demetrios Brankman from ML Labs community. We were chatting over the weekend about this, kind of our predictions for what's next. And one of the things he hit on really hard was valuations will rise, revenue will probably stay the same or decline. So, I thought that was a really good insight because what it hits on is that there's, when you talk about pies, for example, right? Like growing, I think there's a certain amount that you can grow. Maybe the observability pie, for example, I think that's actually quite a huge addressable market. But at the same time, and to how many slices can that go? Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. And the other thing we're seeing is a lot of these like open source focused products are raising money off of things like GitHub stars and Slack channel engagement and such. But like that can only last for so long. At some point, maybe I just don't completely get the play. Maybe the play is to develop enough mind share that like Google or Facebook or someone buys you, and then you just become one of their products, right? Maybe that's what this is about in many cases.
Well, I mean, how I've heard it described is, the I call it Slack math. So if there's X number of people, say 5,000 people in your Slack group, when maybe a certain percentage of them, say 1%, 50 of them buy your product at 100,000 a piece, then you start talking decent money, right? So that's one way to look at it for sure. I do think it's an interesting playbook. I mean, we saw a lot of this during the similar types of stuff during the .com. I would say that every time somebody brings up .com, though, I always get a bit wary because that was just a different time when technology hadn't had, just the embedding that it has now with basically every aspect of life. If you look at the S&P back in the 2000s, it was like, what was it, Exxon or something? Those types of companies were your number one companies. Now it's all tech, and so I don't think you can make the same argument. But that said, I've spent a lot of time studying manias and bubbles over the centuries, and I think that there is a theme where when you start deviating from kind of underlying value, like are you making money, right? Are you those kind of things? I think it just becomes a bit more of a stretch to justify valuations, and you start having these weird machinations. But that's kind of besides the point in some ways too. But the point is there's just a lot of money out there, which means there's a lot of companies because that's how it is. So
yeah, and the proliferation we've been seeing lately, I mean, there are certainly companies that are focusing on databases, but it seems like there's so much activity in the what you call enterprise data engineering space. And that is things that used to be, still are associated with Informatica, right? Like data lineage and data quality and these very core attributes of data that in the past smaller companies just haven't had the resources to focus on.
That's another big trend, actually. That's I think it's something we're psyched about, right? Is that data engineering became enterprisey. And data in general, right? Whether you're talking data engineering, data science, ML, and other workloads, like everything became enterprise. And what does that mean, right? It's talking about ops, which means observability, monitoring, automation, that kind of stuff, but also other things too, data catalogs, right? So things that were typically reserved for large companies, and every time you talk about them to most data people back in the day, they'd be like, that is like the most boring topic I've ever heard of. Let's talk about pig scripts and Hadoop. That's more interesting. That's changed, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, data lake. So it started with Hadoop, and then you had the term data lake coined. And the idea originally with data lake is we're going to throw out all the old paradigms of data. Like you don't need to update data, you don't need to delete data. And now all the old things have become new again. Now it's like very fashionable to update data, especially and to delete it with things like GDPR. It's important to manage your data. It's important to know what you have so that you don't get sued for having someone's private data and you don't like get dinged on an audit and pay big fines or something like that.
For sure. Yeah. Guy Thompson calls out data governance. Yep. Another big one for sure. That's enterprisey. The word governance, I think I'm curious to see where this term goes because it does. I think it's polarizing, right? On one hand, I think we've just come to accept that, oh, it's data governance. But if you say the word governance to most people, what okay, if I say the word governance to you, what comes to mind?
Well, so the first thing that comes to mind, frankly, is command and control. And I think we're not fans of command and control approach. We do hope that enterprises will invest more resources into just managing their data and taking care of it and being careful with it, especially private data. But that doesn't have to happen centrally. In fact, the new generation of tools, I would say, are designed to make that process more diffuse and to give individual teams responsibility over their own data.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what you're going to see is, especially as, ideas like data mesh, I think become more of a reality. I mean, that's all about decentralization, right? It's sort of the antithesis of what you're seeing right now. I wouldn't say right now, but what you have seen with centralized data stores, centralized data teams, but it's just, again, these are the same. If you want to know how to predict things, look at where software's been and is going. Like, you can just take the big ideas from software and basically just use those for data and ML. Just recycle. That's really all that's happening in enterprisey, data right now, is you're recycling a lot of the concepts, a lot of the best practices from software engineering, and not without great reason, because they work, right? And so I think the curve is going to be accelerated, though, because it's not like because data is like 10 years behind software that it's not going to be. It's a consistent 10-year lag. Like, you can take the learnings and ramp up much more quickly. So
here's an interesting idea. So here's where we start riffing, and you can get us back on track here in a second.
Yeah, maybe.
I would say the tech space is still dominated by software developers. In other words, yes, people found lots of software companies just intended to be data companies right from the get-go. But in the last, I would say, 20 years, usually it was software developers who were starting these tech companies. Often it was even like front-end developers. They could put together a website quickly and get something off the ground. Is there going to be a shift where in the future it's going to be like data people who start a product and start a SaaS platform and say, yes, we're going to have a front end. Yes, we're going to have a user interface, but really this platform is all about data. Like, that's the main focus here.
Well,
and they're going to run the show.
Let's segue into predictions for 2022 then, because I think this touches on something. You hear these, or you see these terms like data product and data applications being thrown about. And I think with good reason, because the life cycle of data is being introduced much more into user-facing apps.
Yes.
Right. So in the past, and I've worked on these where you have to provide maybe summary statistics, as close to real time as possible, hopefully, of basically what's going on with maybe a user's account, or, I think Uber and DoorDash are really good examples of companies that have been doing this forever, where, you open up the app, you order something, you can see on the map where things are going, right? You can real-time feedback. To me, those are data apps.
Absolutely. I mean, Uber and DoorDash and Google Maps don't work without like really fantastic machine learning and data management, basically behind the scenes.
Yeah. And so the notion of data apps, I think you're going to start seeing a lot more of this in data products in 2022. Again, it's these are things you still see maybe in certain Slack channels of data communities, but I think it's just going to come front and center as more and more companies start embracing the idea of embedded analytics and just kind of a data-first approach to applications. What does this mean for software developers, though?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one thing we advocate for is that we kind of tear down this boundary between application data and analytics data. I mean, yes,
right.
You have to have somewhat different systems that you do integrate them together, but you do have to have somewhat different systems to handle those two parts of an application, right? But there's often been this throw it over the wall problem where application developers just do whatever they want, and then the analysts and the machine learning engineers is expected to clean up the data that flows out, right? And ideally, if there's more of a product approach to data, then there will be more communication about, hey, your application data, how are you going to change it so we can make appropriate changes on the analytics side? Or let's coordinate on how you change your application to improve the real-time analytics that come out of a dashboard, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's one prediction is, you're just going to see data products as a first-class citizen, not just in 2022, but beyond. I think that data apps are here to stay. You're going to see a lot more companies forming around getting data apps to market really quickly. We're already seeing this, but I think that it's going to be cranked to 11 over the next few years, just because that's how it goes.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I was reading on Monte Carlo's blog. Shout out to the Monte Carlo crew, by the way. But they had a really good blog post with kind of, predictions as well. I don't know if you got a chance to read, but I'll mention one of them and we can riff on this. So Bob Muglia, he was the old CEO of Snowflake, and Bar Moses, did a chat. And one of the things that came up, I think it was the first point in the article, was over the next several years, there will be no difference between a data lake and a data warehouse. I actually tend to agree with this assessment.
Yeah, me too. I mean, quite frankly, I think was it in 20, when did Databricks Delta come out? It was probably like 2017 or 2016.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was on the Databricks platform at the time. And before that, the emphasis was like, here's Spark, it's open source, but we manage it for you and it's awesome. And then suddenly it was like, oh, by the way, we're making this a lot more like a data warehouse because that's where the money was, right? And yeah, I think, that boundary is slowly disappearing. I mean, I think what we'll have in the future is basically, whether it's Databricks or Snowflake, you're going to have something that's very similar to a data warehouse. And then you'll have other components of that data platform that can manage like unstructured data, but in the same general platform.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at where Snowflake and Databricks are going, it's like they're on a collision course. It's almost like they're going tit for tat on features. Snowflake's introducing, other programming languages and platforms. You can now run Jupyter notebooks, in the Snowflake platform and so forth. I think that's great. On the flip side, like SQL, for Databricks was just, I think, generally available as of last week. So that's cool. And yeah, I mean, I think it's an exciting time. As we're writing this book, for example, whenever I write, I've had the damnedest time writing, about data systems, and I substitute the word database in often because I'm like, well, okay, if I mention something, does it apply to a data lake? Does it apply to a data warehouse? And at the end of the day, I'm like, screw it. I mean, they all have the properties of a database, so I'm just going to call it that, right? So what's going on under the hood is like, ACID compliant transactions, the ability to time travel, which is kind of an advanced feature for a database. But the whole point being, there's just a lot more rigor that's going on underneath the hood with these storage engines than it used to be. And I think I think Bob Muglia is correct. There really won't be much of a difference between data lakes and data warehouses. Is it called a data lake house? I don't know. I mean, whatever term I suppose that is most commonly adopted becomes the term, whether you like it or not. So
yeah, I agree. I think another theme we're going to see in 2022 is just the continued, not just growth of streaming, but the continued merge of streaming and batch processing. And so quietly, it's funny, like Google actually has one of the best solutions for this with BigQuery. But frankly, they haven't done a fantastic job of getting that message out there. But I think Snowflake is moving in this direction. I was reading some Databricks documentation and marketing materials over the weekend. They're really pushing this idea of unified batch and streaming.
Spark's always had unified batch and micro batch streaming under the hood, right? So
but they're pushing it so hard, right? And they used to emphasize, Spark streaming and then Spark, and now it's just like, no, it's just a continuum. Don't worry about the difference so much. So.
Yeah, and I think on that note too, streaming is just going to become more front and center for a lot of things. I mean, it's the most obvious thing in the world. Like everything's moving that way, and so new school. Replication, change data capture engines like Moroxa, I think are going to be that approach is going to be a lot more prominent, where it's streaming first, right? And so I mean, because as we always say, like batch is really a special case of streaming, and we stole that from the Flink documentation, actually, in case anyone wants to call us out on that. So but when you think about it, it's true. So I think streaming is going to become more of a first class citizen. What else from a technical angle do you see happening in 2022?
That's interesting. So one thing we talked about before the show is that Snowflake has been pushing this idea that DBAs are going to disappear. And I don't entirely agree, I'll tell you. But I think the nature of the DBA is going to change dramatically. If you're a DBA, you don't have to install the latest build of Teradata, for example. Instead, you're going to worry about things like table optimization and maybe things like data management. So that role is going to change a lot. It will remain technical, but the nature of the technical skills for DBA are going to change quite a bit. And DBAs may even be responsible for managing streaming data in various cases, which is kind of a pretty radical change from a few years ago.
Well, and that's just kind of the nature of the job, right? So it depends on, as Bill Clinton said, what depends on the definition of what is. So what is a database? I think you can make some argument that, your streaming platforms, your log-based streaming platforms are essentially a database of some sort, right? They house data, and so depending on how you partition that data and how you offset everything, I mean, it's kind of like it reads like a database, so it quacks like a database, probably as a database, and so for DBA, I think what you're saying is the approach is going to be sort of an evolution of the type of systems you're working in.
Right.
Yeah.
And the nature of the
it's-
job, right? Just the things you optimize, the technical details that you care about are going to change, but the job is still going to remain very important.
Yeah,
in some
I
sense.
agree.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Now that going back to the streaming conversation, I think a big change we've seen in the last couple of years.
Well, let me ask you this though,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So, I mean, we talk about DBAs.
Okay.
What do you think is going to get in the way of a DBA wanting to embrace new types of databases? Because there's new types of databases coming out a lot, right? New next gen OLAP stuff like Roxette, Firebolt, Imply, and so forth. Like, if you're a DBA and you're used to the SQL Server paradigm,
yeah,
what sort of change are you going to have to make with that, and also streaming?
I mean, okay, so I'll say this: we've seen a lot of DBAs who really don't want to learn new things. Companies we worked with, we've had people quit because they're like, no, I don't want to learn. I don't want to learn stuff. Like, I'm just going to stick to whatever old thing I know really, really well. I'm going to keep finding jobs. And the truth is, they can probably just bounce around and live out their whole career that way and never learn anything new. But I think if you are interested in new technology, then it's funny, like, you still need to understand the under the hood details of these systems. We've seen that be a problem with Snowflake and BigQuery and a lot of columnar databases, where if you try to treat them like the older systems and like do merges all the time, you're not never good. It's going to be really bad.
Right.
So DBAs need to understand like how these systems work under the hood in order to optimize them. And that's where I kind of disagree with Snowflake. It's like, yeah, there aren't as many knobs to turn, but things like how you design your queries and how you design your streaming patterns and updates, those things actually matter quite a bit.
Right. We're just looking at the the source systems too, right? Because I mean, those source systems, we're talking maybe a SQL Server backend for an application that you have changed data capture, streaming into Snowflake. I mean, you're still going to have to manage maybe that application database, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. Yeah.
Right.
And there are different types of DBAs. You have kind of your data warehouse DBAs, and you have your more application backend DBAs.
Yeah. I mean, even that's getting, I think it's interesting with the cloud, because I feel like, databases, if you're looking at like Aurora, for example, right? Like that greatly simplifies a lot of things.
Or Spanner, for example. I think they kind of argue, you have this ultra scalable cluster database that can operate across many regions and back an application, but it operates at huge scale, almost like a big data database.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. But then again, the clouds are still offering certs, and a lot of, like there's AWS database specialty, which dives into the innards of, Dynamo and RDS and Aurora and everything else. Like, so I mean, anyway, it's the role of DBA. I think DBA is going to be here. I just think it's going to change a lot. Let me see. Peter Bjorn, what's up? He says, the argument I get from our Oracle DBAs is that Hadoop came and went, and we avoided a lot of wasted effort. How do I argue that current gen is different in terms of longevity and value?
So I would say the current gen is actually an evolution of Hadoop in a lot of ways, right? So in some sense, Snowflake and BigQuery are the mature version of Hadoop, if that makes any sense at all, because Hadoop introduced the cluster processing paradigm, and it was a big pain in the butt to manage, as a lot of teams discovered. It was very expensive to manage. You could manage it. You could buy an expensive Cloudera license, have a big team to manage the whole cluster. And now, essentially, these modern databases are doing the same thing for you, but taking care of all of that under the hood. So yes, evolution is going to continue, but I think we've reached kind of a state of stability in these systems where they're very easy to use, and so they're just going to continue growing at this point.
Yeah, and I think it's you may have dodged a bullet in terms of having to manage Hadoop, but you still get to manage your current Oracle cluster. So I don't know, I mean, it just seems, I think it's for the next generation databases, I really think it depends also on the environment that you're spinning this up in. The thing that has really changed is the nature of the cloud, really. So, you have cloud first databases. And I think those are growing, rapidly. You can still spin open source up, but I think it also depends on, what sort of wasted effort do you want to have? And where do you not want to waste effort? I would say wasting effort means spinning stuff up, on Kubernetes these days. And, when you have potentially a managed service behind the hood. Now, obviously, people have their reasons for spinning up clusters. And I think some of these are valid reasons. At the same time, if you can avoid, that extra work, and spend that on other stuff, I just think the argument really, because you're talking about a different era as well. Hadoop was like 15 years ago, and then through like sort of early 2000s or 2010s. And after that, I think just things started changing. So it would have been a lot of overhead to run that. I don't think it's the same. I don't think the same argument really holds as much weight these days with the same with current generation databases.
Yeah, the other thing is that Snowflake and BigQuery and even Redshift and Databricks behave a lot more like these traditional data warehouses, and that's a huge advantage, right? You don't have to have a specialist team of engineers who are experts in open source software. You can mostly transition from an existing database pretty easily. You do need to learn some things about columnar databases and operating at scale and efficiency, but that's a much easier transition than having to install all your own HDFS and everything and write pig jobs.
Right. Yeah. So I would say that, the argument really is current generation is just, it's not the same thing.
Right.
Right. And so I don't know, take it for what it's worth.
Yeah.
It's always an argument that you're going to have, though, because I think there's just resistance to change no matter what it is. And people will find excuses for not changing and not adopting new things. That's just human nature.
Definitely is. Yeah. But you do risk getting left behind. You can be, basically a COBOL developer if you want to, and probably do fine that way. If that's what you want to do, you might have to bounce around between a few jobs or go to specialty consulting firms that are very concerned with certain types of older technology, but you can get away with that. Or you can start adopting the new things and have a career that way.
Yeah, I think it just depends where in your career you are and where you work. What we see is a lot of people, DBAs or otherwise that may have quote 15 years of experience, but what that really means is it's like the 1 year of experience times 20 or something. So you haven't really progressed your knowledge since you started. So, and
it's deep on one thing, right? But that's not the same thing as understanding the whole ecosystem.
In this argument here, I will point out, if you're pointing out that Hadoop came and went and you avoided a lot of wasted effort, it also indicates that you haven't been spending time looking at what's been going on in the landscape right now.
Hadoop is old now, but there's a lot of new stuff that it shows. I mean, it's beyond promise. It's kind of taking over certain sectors of the market at this point.
Yeah. So it's sort of like reminds me of the people that reference make references to bad 80s movies or something, and they still think people will get the reference. You're just like,
we do that sometimes, don't we?
Yeah, but that's because we grew up on
them.
Yeah, but I think we're also trying to make an effort to be current, right?
We're working on it.
Yeah. So, good question, Peter. I mean, some other predictions. I think these aren't really predictions. These are just sort of like calling out the obvious, like hiring's still going to be hard, right? Like that's a softball. It's sort of like saying, oh, the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow morning and set in the west. It's like, hiring's gonna be hard because you have there's a huge talent gap right now. What this is gonna mean, though, I think it's not gonna get any better in 2022. There's a few reasons. One, I don't know, just remote work is still getting kind of shunted off because of COVID variants and stuff.
Yep.
And so you're just in a very unpredictable environment.
And that's just it. Let's call these anti-predictions. In other words, I think what we're really saying here is that 2022 is going to be very hard to predict because there's so much uncertainty, and there are multiple types of uncertainty going on. There's the economic uncertainty we see, which is tied in with COVID and everything else, right? Like rising inflation, uncertainty about future of interest rates, frankly, like kind of crazy valuations for a lot of companies, crazy amounts of investments in startups that don't have any revenue. Where's that going? Well, it can go in a number of different directions, and we don't know where it's going. And then there's Omicron, and we were talking about this earlier. One possibility is that Omicron turns out to be really dangerous, and like we have to start locking down again. Another possibility is that Omicron spreads really fast, but isn't that dangerous? Maybe it kind of immunizes the population or something. I don't know what's going to happen.
I don't know. I'm not a virologist.
No, but like there are a lot of conflicting messages coming out right now, even from like major health leaders. And so I think they don't know what's going on yet. They're just trying to collect a lot of data and figure out what's happening.
Have they ever?
Well, to some extent. I mean, I think they kind of knew how dangerous COVID was initially, that it was not as dangerous as like the Spanish flu or something, but at the scale of a population.
Yeah, you should read it. Michael Lewis has, as a side note, you should read Michael Lewis's The Premonition. It is a fantastic book out for anyone who's into reading Michael Lewis. Fantastic book. He goes into basically just the inept response to COVID early on by a lot of the institutions. And I'm not turning this into a political argument, but it's interesting, I would say, just because there was the reaction could have been better. We may not have been here, if people had reacted better, but it is what it is. So Thanks for listening to my TED Talk.
Right.
So
I mean, if you listen into this show very often, you know that we're fans of Nicholas Nassim Taleb.
Taleb or Talib?
Taleb?
Yeah,
I don't
think
know.
it's Taleb.
Sorry, I'm probably just mispronouncing. I apologize for mispronouncing your name if you ever hear this. Anyway,
Get out. Leave.
The problem is that we in society we have a hard time preparing for things that don't happen often but are still probable. So in other words, like things that might have a 10% chance of happening over 10 years. We don't deal with that very often, so we have a hard time of being ready for something like that. And so same thing with COVID. Like pandemics this century or last century didn't happen that often, and therefore we try to have these institutions to prepare, but then we gradually defund them because they're supposedly expensive. Like, oh, well, why do I need this? Pandemics don't happen often. And then one lands and we just don't have the resources to cope with it. And
I was reading somewhere that it would cost you listening somewhere on a podcast. So it's true. Right. It would cost you like $50 billion to vaccinate the entire world and just be done with this damn thing. But anyway, so it's interesting. But a lot of, I would say, what's interesting right now when you try and make predictions about technology is just the number of feedback loops and how deeply entwined they are is, I think, much more apparent these days. When you have things like supply chain shocks, messing with your ability to get simple things like computers or phones, right, which impacts your ability to work. I know I have furniture on order that might show up in March. I don't know, maybe. And it's manufactured here, by the way, too. So if anyone knows anybody who works at Herman Miller, give me a call.
Or make some threats or something.
I don't want to threaten them. They'll just send me a crappy picture. They'll just fall apart.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, other predictions, I think it's I always try to approach predictions from a couple levels, really, where it's like, what's a continuation from this year into next year? Like that to me is kind of, there's a linear predictions you can make where you're just extrapolating like this is going to continue happening. But I always try and take the counterpoint of thinking, okay, so what could come out of left field and change things, right? And so these are I would say more kind of dramatic hypothesizing in some respects and good navel gazing exercises with friends over beers or something. So let's start with the obvious things. Like what else is going to happen, do you think? Maybe we'll talk about the clouds.
Well, actually, I want to focus on data real quick, and then we'll loop back to the clouds because I think these are very much intertwined conversations. Who's it? The CEO of MicroStrategy? Is it Michael Saylor or?
I have no idea what his name is.
Okay. I put it in my notes anyway. I don't have that page up. But he was. I listened to a podcast by him, and this was clear back like right after COVID started. He said, "Yeah, we've basically seen our business explode." He actually ended up putting a bunch of that money into Bitcoin, but he was just saying, everyone cares about data now because with COVID, everything is very uncertain, and so it's very important to capture a lot of data to try to figure out what's going on at any given point in time. And I optimistically think that is a cultural shift in businesses, that many of them have learned to care about data based on COVID happening. And so I believe going into 2022, companies are going to continue spending on data rather than simply seeing it as a cost center.
Let me ask you this. Is there a situation where companies care less about data?
I think in a domain, I think we've seen a lot of businesses get kind of complacent, frankly, and that's where they start to not care about data. It's like, oh, well, I've run this particular type of business. I've done it for 100 years. I'm not going to invest more in IT. I'll just do the bare minimum of IT that I need and not worry about it. It's a cost center. Don't worry about it. But it does seem like there has been a shift toward an emphasis on data, at least for now.
There seems to be more, I think there's two classes of that. There's an investment in data from companies that have known for a while they need to invest in it. There's also startups, I would say, that kind of data first startups that are coming on the scene and they're taking data seriously from day one. So that's also cool to see. Normally it's been an afterthought with startups because like, well, I get my product out the door, right? Which is understandable. You have limited time and runway, so do what you need to do. But it's interesting seeing the number of companies, startups that are springing up that are data first actually, and so they take this into consideration from day one.
And I mean, frankly, Google obviously was a data first startup, right? Like that was their product, but still, I don't think a lot of startup companies in like the 2000s and 2010s necessarily learned that lesson. And of course, it's hard to imitate Google.
Google. But we see some data first startups, I would say, who are still, they could use a lot of help with architecture, and so
definitely,
but that's I think more of an education thing than anything. Speaking of Google, I mean, I think in moving to the clouds, I think we have a prediction It's a pretty obvious one. GCP and Azure are going to continue to grow share.
Yep.
But let's dig into the nuances of why.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. Our assessment of the cloud data warehouse space, or let's call it cloud data platform space, just to not offend anyone with our terminology, is that at this point, well, you kind of have three major data platforms, right? You have Google BigQuery, which the way Google designed it, it integrates across a lot of their different tools. So it integrates right into Vertex AI, for example. So it really is more of like a data platform. You have Snowflake, and Snowflake is really pushing the data platform concept as well. And you have Databricks. And then you kind of have Redshift, that was the first mover, and they're trying to, Amazon is trying to update it to compete with these others. But so far it's been, kind of lukewarm. It's been, yeah. So I think because Google has done a good job of building a really solid data platform, we are seeing them grow share. Microsoft has grown share in other ways. In particular, they own Windows, which means that they can provide the best first-party support for Windows-based virtual machines. But they have a two-pronged attack. So instead of just focusing on Microsoft products, they've done a really great job of also offering Linux. In fact, the last thing I read, it was something like 60% of cores on Azure were reported to be running Linux, which is kind of insane, right? So they're covering both your very open source oriented Silicon Valley aspect of things, and also grabbing companies that have Windows assets that need to migrate to the cloud, or that need managed Active Directory and those kinds of things. So I think Google's emphasis on enterprise cuts kind of both ways, right? There are a lot of people who are not super happy about the way that GCP has pushed more of an enterprise sales model, but it does seem to be working in certain respects in terms of getting enterprise customers. So.
Yeah. And so, but I think it's a continuation of a lot of trends that we've seen, right? So, because it's not like you just can start a cloud today and get market share tomorrow. It's a lot of hard work.
It's a lot of hard work. Yeah. And, AWS had that huge first mover advantage, and they're going to continue to be a major platform for Databricks and Snowflake and everything else. But then on the Google side, that data platform is kind of built into the cloud somewhat more. I think AWS has a lot of great data products, but, again, Redshift is kind of falling behind the other players in this space. So, yeah.
So this Redshift serverless, and I know I've been talking about, I'll have a video up on that soon. I will. I've just been busy writing a book and
we've been
mad busy with business lately, so just haven't had time to make a video. Sorry. What other predictions do we have for 2022?
Again, let me emphasize the anti-predictions, and that is just be ready for a couple of different scenarios. Think about scenarios economically, think about scenarios in terms of data, in terms of tech funding, in terms of talent too, right? There could be a dramatic shift in demand that may affect how you hire or how you look for a job if you are thinking about moving jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too. I would say the hiring's an interesting one. The job market's really hot right now. I've seen this happen before, though, where people, I think, get a bit, overly, settled in the fact that they're a hot commodity.
Right.
And then the market turns on a dime. And then suddenly they're like, oh, crap, I am overextended on my bills and my lifestyle, right? Because engineers, we do well, right? And so I would say, kind of an anti-prediction, or, an anti-fragile prediction maybe, is just make sure that you're covered, with kind of the basics in case the things do change. In rising interest rates, it's going to change things. Valuations are going to go down, right?
Seems like they have to. It just doesn't look like the current situation.
I mean, Warren Buffett always said that interest rates are sort of like the anti-gravity on asset prices, right? So, or gravity or whatever, but they, low interest rates means high asset prices, and reverse. If you look at how discounted cash flows works, that's literally what it is. Like, in your denominator, you have 1 plus the rate, times whatever period of time you're looking at. But if that rate is close to 0, then you're just dividing by 1, and so you pull all that value forward, for years, and that's kind of what's happened. And so I think if you see public market valuations going down, that by necessity would most likely mean private valuations are going to go down. And how does it impact all the data companies out there? I don't know. I would suspect you might be raising less money at a lower valuation, but it's hard to say, but that's definitely one scenario. So what does that mean for people out there looking for work, in 2022? Just go into it with your eyes wide open, because things could change. I've seen them change literally overnight.
That's right. Yeah. And I feel like people of our generation who were just kind of at a critical period in their lives when the last big real estate crisis hit, the Great Recession, are a little bit shell-shocked even now from it. And so hopefully we're acting in a cautious way, not such a cautious way that we never take any risks, but that we can be prepared for the future if things do happen to change. Right?
Yeah, although I do remember when the market crashed in 2020, I was plowing. I was super aggressive at the time because I also realized like there were times when I should have been more aggressive. And so I did not hold back when everything like when it seemed like the sky was falling, and it was. And I was like, because I'm like, I'm going to go all in, because the worst case that's going to happen is none of this matters anyway in a few weeks.
It's that bad. Anyway, this is our gloom and doom prediction.
Yeah. So anyway, the world's going to call it to an end. It's going to be great. Audience, what are some of your questions? Or some of your data predictions for 2022? Before Matt and I end up, going off the deep end and commiserating on stuff. Actually, Guy has a prediction here. We'll see more tools that make data easier for non-technical people. Definitely, I think it's a huge trend.
In fact, one of my friends, I've known for a long time through Google and other places, has argued that there's room for new business intelligence tools. I'll be curious to see if she's right about that. I mean, I think Looker and Tableau and Superset are fantastic tools, but she was kind of arguing, but there's space for maybe a different.
Looker's been around for almost 10 years now, right? And Tableau's been around for like 1,000 years or something.
Yeah, basically Power BI, like the traditional players. And, Superset is a nice open source product, but it does have its limitations. It's very focused on a particular type of application. So maybe we'll see something new happen there. Yeah.
I think that this is, non-technical people for sure. I was kind of riffing on Dimitrios Brinkman again. Shout out to Dimitrios. But he had a good post today on LinkedIn talking about predictions for 2022, but wrong answers only. So
maybe that's our show today. Wrong answers
only. We could go this direction, I guess. But yeah, I mean, on that note too, I said definitely like Excel ops, what else, SVM ops would be cool. So we'll see how that goes.
I wonder if Excel ops is wrong though. I mean, there are these products that like let you have something spreadsheet like that scales to like 100 million rows instead of a million rows.
I don't know, man. I mean,
grow. I don't know.
As Mark Keeling points out, TensorFlow and sklearn integration in Excel. He's joking. But I think be careful how you joke about these kind of things, Mark. You got to be really, don't summon the demons here. But this is an interesting one. I mean, if you think about Excel, what's the most widely used data platform in the world? Excel, right? Depending where you look, it's 750 million users or greater.
Yeah. And I mean, from a technical standpoint, why doesn't Excel scale? Well, one of the major issues is that it orders rows, right? I mean, in fact, if I create a spreadsheet, that's something that I rely on, the fact that you have rows in a particular order. But can you imagine something like Excel-like, where rows are no longer ordered, or maybe only particular rows are ordered, and you can have 1 billion rows where the order doesn't matter anymore because it's just data, like in a database, but it gives people more access to that data. I don't know. Maybe that's a product idea for someone.
I don't know. Another product idea that's going to be happening a lot is what Peter's talking about with the metric layer. He feels like the semantic layer is not yet a solved problem. I totally agree. I'm actually spending a lot of the weekend researching this, headless BI and the metrics layers and stuff. And I think this is definitely an area where, to your point earlier, this, I think, is the next generation of where BI is going. So I was actually talking to another person last week about this, and they're asking, well, so, this is, I think, where things are going to go, but the incumbent players, are kind of, I think like Looker and Tableau, I think is one of the things that set people off. Like, well, is Looker going to, parse out LookML and have that as a separate product?
That's an interesting idea,
right? But I think it also comes down to, I don't think this disruption is going to happen through a big player because they increasingly are just moved too slow. And so I think it's really going to be somebody doing something like what DBT did, which is just kind of coming out of left field.
Yep.
With an entirely, I wouldn't say what DBT is doing is necessarily new, because if you've ever used like template languages, it's like, we used Jinja for a long time. If you use Flask, you're using Jinja, but the whole point is it's the application of it, right? Not the technical layer.
It's a consistent interface, right? Like most DBAs or even data engineers don't want to be writing custom Jinja Python to manage their SQL queries. But if you give them a platform to do that, they're like, this is awesome. Like I can do all kinds of things with this. It makes SQL much more powerful. In fact, I had a rant this week. What did we publish that on Thursday about how any aspiring data engineer should really learn SQL. Not that SQL is like the end all be all, but it's just like a really good foundation for becoming a data engineer, analyst, data scientist, any kind of data professional.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you enhance SQL, it's an even better language.
For sure. And he's heavily anticipating the DBT metric system. Yeah, I mean, it just came out of Coalesce. I need to spend some time digging into that because I think it's a really cool announcement. And I mean, this could push the field forward a lot. So I think it's just decoupling. Basically, the whole notion is just decoupling the semantic metrics layer from like all the other stuff. Because if you think about what a BI system is now, it's basically a giant monolith. Everything's tied together. Looker was really the first company I think that made an attempt to sort of separate these things out and give it more rigor. But like a lot of things, progression happens in fits and starts, right? So,
and the thing about Looker, the thing that shows me that there are opportunities here, one thing, there are many actually, is that Looker still runs on a server, right? Like it's a SaaS platform, but behind the scenes, they spin up a server for you to run Looker. It's not truly like a distributed microservices-based system. Now, it's owned by Google, so they could move in that direction. I have faith in Google, but someone else may come in and build like more of a true SaaS platform that's very modern and does new things. I mean, I don't know.
There's a lot of them out there. So any other predictions from the audience? I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, you get to hear Matt and I rant about whatever. So no, but the data, I think the other big trend though is that things are going to get more enterprisey. Again, we were just talking about metrics layers and semantic layers. I mean, this was not really a discussion even a couple of years ago. Depending on who you talk to, this wasn't a mainstream discussion at least. But again, this is just an attempt, I think, to make things more enterprisey in data. This is happening in, data engineering, data science, ML, et cetera. And so I think you're just going to keep seeing more nuanced approaches to this. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Mark says hopefully more serverless systems. Yeah, I agree.
Serverless BI, for example, which I mean, Google Data Studio is kind of serverless BI, but it's just very limited in what it can do.
Yeah, I mean, but so if somebody comes to you though and says, "Oh, it's serverless versus it has a server," I mean, does that what is that? Is that going to sway the decision for you to buy a system?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally, if you're an enterprise leader, it's about scalability, right? Like if I have this huge spike in people looking at dashboards on Black Friday,
I think the consideration though is definitely like, what's the cost,
right? And cost,
right? Because I mean, this is one thing where I will push back and say, like, I think things like Redshift are great, especially if you're doing embedded analytics and you're using a system where it's kind of pay as you go. This also sucks if you don't know what your consumption pattern is, because you could be caught off guard and end up paying a lot of money for spikes in queries and consumption. So I would say I do agree. I think fundamentally that serverless is good, but I do get scared when I see I do get concerned when I see people like blindly going into serverless without understanding, okay, so like what's the usage pattern? Just because I mean, more than once we've definitely had people come away not just disappointed, but I think almost at the point where they're about to lose their jobs.
Right. So, or you can spend $1 million on a serverless product very quickly. And we've talked about a notion in our book of like a financial attack. In other words, we generally think in terms of, getting DDoSed or something. Well, if someone knows, if they can see behind the scenes that you're using certain infrastructure patterns and they can hit your site with a lot of requests that will generate a lot of costs, that could also be a new type of attack. Like if you know that you can drive, 1 billion Lambda like calls or something like this, that can get expensive very quickly if someone can attack you.
Yeah, some of the companies out there who are advertising they're using serverless, maybe be a bit more quiet about that.
Be careful, or have something in front of it like Cloudflare just to make sure.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, it's I mean, I think it's sort of as an aside too, as it relates to data, like security in cyber attacks. I think that's sort of the other area I don't see a lot of data professionals talking about, but I think that and privacy, all rolled up in one are like some of the big issues that we need to tackle in data, not just in 2022, but for, from here to kingdom come, because that could set things, any breach, any mistake, outages, ransomware, et cetera. Your nice stack, all the nice metrics layers you just built kind of don't matter at that point. You got compromised.
Yeah. Yeah, and we talk a lot about how there needs to be a more proactive approach to data security and less compliance oriented. So yes, compliance is something you need to do, but compliance is kind of the minimum standard. In other words, you need to think almost like a white hat hacker. Like, okay, how would I try to hack into my own systems, and how do I
or
prevent that?
black hat, really? I mean, you should be like you need to be the most evil, malicious person,
right?
When you're thinking about how you're going to compromise yourself. So, yeah. And or make friends with hackers and just have them
hire them to help you out.
But I'm dead serious when I say this. I think this is actually one of the trends I don't see a lot of people talking about, but it's I think it's one guy from Satori. I think he calls it DevSecOps, but I would call it data SecOps maybe, where this security is just going to be front and center more. And I wish people would talk more about this, because everyone's focused on it's kind of like in data, people just I think disregard security.
Yeah.
It's like, oh well, that's a security guy's problem,
someone else's problem,
right? Like you're assuming everything's working.
Yeah.
But it's definitely I think a big gap. I don't see a lot of people focus on this area as much as they should.
Yeah,
because the security is like the number one thing you need to be focused on as a data engineer, I think, in my opinion, or an engineer period. Because if your system gets compromised, like I said, all the cool stuff that you just built goes out the window.
Yeah. And one of the issues we see is that Snowflake or BigQuery or even Databricks now are so easy to set up that I can just jump in and turn it, flip a switch and have something up and running. But it's too easy. That is, it's too easy to just have something turned on that's not actually secure if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm.
Too often we, see excessive access to sensitive data, not enough access controls, not enough auditing, not enough control of super user groups and those kinds of basic issues. And so it's one thing to start as a startup and have one person running the data stack and have that problem, but then it grows into, 10 people and 50 people accessing that data stack without adequate changes to make sure that access controls are in place.
Right. Yeah. So, I think that this is going to be one of the areas where you're going to see just a lot more activity, just because it has to happen. There's too much financial motivation for cyber criminals to not do what they're doing. Like, if I can do ransomware all day and make a lot of money, why not? And plus, ransomware companies, I was reading, ransomware insurance companies are actually like really reluctant to pay out anymore, just because these things happen too often, and as an insurance company, it produces a loss. Like the probability of somebody having a ransomware attack is just getting it's increasing a lot, to the point where from an insurance standpoint, the risk is too high.
Yeah,
so I'm not going to fund it.
Well, the rates are going to go up and up, right?
Yeah, they will.
It's going to become prohibitive.
I mean, it reminds me of like we have a cabin over in Wyoming, and it's in the woods, and what I've noticed, we still thankfully have fire insurance, but I don't know that will be who knows if that'll be available at some point, just because Western forest fires are a real thing, and I know people who have had their fire insurance revoked. Like the insurance company's like, this is basically 100% probability where I'm going to be paying this out,
risk,
right? And so why, so sort of an aside, I think if anything, I think security is going to be sort of the dark horse prediction for 2022 and beyond, just because it's so highly ignored. And it's such an open playing field for bad actors to come in and just do really bad things to your nice data stack that you just build, and compromise all your data and sell it on the dark web. So,
and again, avoid ceremonial security. Like you're saying, oh, well, encryption is a magic bullet. It's like, yeah, but you still need to control access to encryption keys. So how are you doing that? Like, there are no magic bullets to security. You've got to think of, in terms of scenarios.
Yeah, but a lot of it's human based, though, right?
That's just it, right? Like it comes down to like a human needing to decrypt that field, so they have access to the security key, and if they leak it, then suddenly other people can get access to your data.
Tiago says, just joined, hoping Joe will play a song for us in the last data chat of the year. The last data chat of the year is next week, actually.
That's right.
So I think that I might take you up on this offer, assuming I'm not totally swamped. But yeah, thanks for that. And also next week we have Luigi Petruno. He's very active in MLOps. He's awesome. So hopefully, get have a fun conversation with him. But that'll be the last show of the year. And then what we do, we just start again the next year. Ben Rogojan's going to be on there.
Always love hanging out with Ben on these shows.
He's he's fun. Did we get any more questions here? I thought I saw one.
I think people are starting to focus on the holidays, which kind of makes sense given it's the 20th.
Well, I mean, what is wrong with people? You know,
why aren't they here listening to us blab? Thanks for everyone who's here listening to us blab.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I know you have a lot of other things to be doing, like either finishing up work for the week.
Yeah.
Which is what we probably should be doing in a bit. But yeah, I hope everybody has a good holiday. You know, it's been a great year. For us, I think for the audience, many I talked to, I think it's been a great year for you guys too. And so I think we're definitely grateful for your support. It feels like in the last year, I feel like things have really blown up. For Matt and I, and that's been awesome. Actually, Tiago has a really good question here before. People are now talking about Web 3.0 based on blockchain. From a data engineering standpoint, I find these solutions nonsense. What do you think about this concept? I think I've just been in tech so long that I've realized that I used to write things off, and what I think happened with that is I missed out on a lot of opportunities. So anymore, I suspend disbelief because I figure that it's not the most obvious uses of these technologies that are the ones that end up winning typically, but I think it's very it's a lot more nuanced. So I mean, the obvious thing with blockchain is that it's going to replace currencies. I think that's a bit of a bad notion because any central bank is not going to just let that happen, especially when you're a reserve currency. But I think Web 3.0 based on blockchain, I think there actually are some interesting applications. What I think could happen with decentralization as a principle, notwithstanding blockchain, but I think just the notion of decentralization actually has a really big future. Probably not for the next couple maybe I don't know. Maybe I mean NFTs and stuff are interesting, but I think that's more of a sideshow. What I really think is interesting is just the notion of coming up with these decentralized systems. But I suppose the question really is: do you need blockchain to do this, or can you just find another way?
Yeah, and the problem, the conception of blockchain as it now exists, in particular with Bitcoin, is kind of a terrible distributed database, right? Because every node has a full copy of the data, and anyone who knows anything about distributed data knows you're supposed to shard it out in various ways.
Yeah.
So that different machines can do different work. But who's to say that someone won't come up with a way of doing something like this?
There's better protocols out there, like Solana does some
exactly.
cool stuff, and and I think it's made for higher transaction rates. But again, and one idea I've been noodling on, and I'm going to throw this out here because I think it's not really a new idea, but it's something that I would love to talk with people about and work on. The idea of a decentralized cloud.
Exactly.
Right. So I mean, if you look at how much computing power you have laying around you, your phones,
it's totally insane.
You have so much. I use the activity monitor on my computer, and and how much idle capacity do you have on your computer right now? A lot, especially not using M1s. For Macs.
Yep.
So to me, that seems like an interesting concept where if you invert the notion of, say, a cloud, and you're like, well, but could the cloud theoretically just exist anywhere? That's something that I've been putting some mental cycles around. So I think in general, there's a lot of nonsense solutions with Web 3.0. I think it's a buzzword that's I think borderline scammy in some ways. But if you look at a lot of the people behind it, I mean, these are a lot of pump and dump crypto bros too, who are I think have a vested interest in pushing something. But if you look at the underlying technology, and this has been something I've thought about with blockchain for years, I think decentralization is going to happen. It has to.
Right.
So.
Well, and I mean, even back in the 80s, I was kind of a computer nerd. And I remember first hearing the term cloud, like in the early 90s, like a long time ago. And if I'm remembering correctly, back then, people were talking about cloud as distribution of computing across PCs, basically. It's like, you have all these machines that are connected. This is kind of like very early days of the internet and such, but all these machines that are connected, and theoretically you can push workloads out across them. And there were some practical implementations of that, like with SETI at Home.
SETI at Home, I was doing that back in the mid 90s.
Yeah. So who's to say that, this won't make a comeback at some point? Like, I think there is a lot to be said for the centralized public clouds that we have right now.
And I hope it happens. Like, I don't like gatekeepers anymore than anybody else does, except the gatekeepers. Right. But I think that, now's the time to so I would say, I do push back in some ways on calling these nonsense. There was a lot of nonsense, to be sure, but there's definitely some nuggets in there. And I would say, again, the thing I've learned in my tech career and just being in tech from basically a child is everything happens in ways you don't expect. And so I just never write anything off anymore. it could be the dumbest idea possible. And like, you know what? There's probably actually an element of truth here. And so who knows? But yeah, good question, Tiago. And maybe I'll have a song for you next week. Mark says, prediction, there's a new fantastic data engineering book. Yeah. So
make that come true.
Well, I hope it's fantastic. I
guess I hope it's fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll keep working on it.
Yeah, for sure. So stay tuned on that. And Peter says, great discussions, interviews this year. Thanks, of course. Yeah, thanks
everyone for joining.
Yeah, and there's a discussion going on LinkedIn on the blockchain thing, so feel free to continue discussing that, because Matt and I have to cut out for a meeting right now. But yeah, great questions through the and support on the show. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube, please do so. Monday Morning Data Chat is available on YouTube as well as a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, feel free to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform. It greatly helps us out. It helps get the word out. And as well as subscribe to our newsletter at ternarydata.com. We have weekly exclusive content. Matt and I basically kind of tag team articles every other week. And so he had a really good one on, recently why software engineers need to, learn SQL if they want to transition to data engineering. And so I have a few things on my mind this week. And anyway, so we'll see you next week. Again, shout out to the audience. Thanks again. Thanks for your support. And we'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye.
Take care.